everyone, thanks so much for being here. My name is Kat and I make houseplant videos here on Good and Planty. If you just so happen to absolutely love this video, please consider liking it, commenting, subscribing, or following me on Instagram. All of these things help me grow my channel like a plant. Okay, so today is the day we are finally discussing moss poles. I have been kind of putting off this video for a number of reasons. Number one, I had to get all of the proper supplies, and number two, I know that this is going to be a monster of a video. Since this was a highly requested topic and one that is a little bit more intimidating, probably for beginners, at least for me, I wanted to make a more well-rounded video rather than just a tutorial. So it probably will be a longer style video, but I will pop up time codes if you want to jump to the section that you are interested in. Today I will be making his Instagram handle is Craig Milren. I will be making his style moss pole, which it's just like the Instagram goals moss pole. If you don't know who Craig is, he definitely has the houseplant collection and home of your dreams, and his moss poles have become kind of popular, I would say, because of the large foliage it promotes. So a lot of his plants that he shows on his Instagram have really big growth, so even plants like marble queens just look so like extravagant because of the growth that these moss poles promote. So obviously, seeing this, I want to try it for myself and I will share my experience with you all. I am trying this method because I previously tried the PVC pipe method, which is where you basically just wrap spag around a PVC pipe with some fishing line, and it sucked. It was so bad. If you are new here, my Micans is pretty famous for just toppling over and being the leaning tower of Micans. This pole was just not strong and stable enough to really handle anything, you know, crazy. I have already made one pole for my Micans, so I switched the Micans from the PVC moss pole to the Craig style moss pole. I am so happy with the results so far. It is stable in the pot. I made it 5 feet tall so it can actually handle all of my Micans growth, and I just find it to look better and serve my Micans a whole lot better. Craig's method is highly successful because it isn't just providing kind of like a pole or support for the plant to grow up, it actually gives a space for roots to grow into, so it is actually growing upwards and not just, you know, being pinned up. When my Micans was on the previous pole, it did push out larger growth, but I do think I'm gonna have a lot more success with this pole. And at the bare minimum, at least it will not be leaning. Another common question that I see is what plants do well on moss poles, and some of the most common, you know, plant groups that do well are philodendron, pothos, syngonium, monstera, rhaphidophora. Those are like the big ones, but there are plenty of plants that you can stake up to a moss pole. Okay, so with all that being said, let's talk about how to build a moss pole. There are really only 4 things that you will need to build this style moss pole, and that is sphagnum moss, number 1. I will link the type of spag that I use in the description box below. You will need coated wire garden mesh. The garden mesh that I got was 36 inches in width and then 5 feet in length. So definitely just keep an eye out on those dimensions depending how tall you want your moss poles to go. You can of course cut them shorter to make shorter moss poles, but for example, I knew I wanted to make a 5-foot moss pole, so I had to make sure at least one of those dimensions was 5 feet. The mesh has 1/2 inch openings, which I found perfect for the moss pole size that I wanted to make. This wire mesh is super sturdy and it is a little bit of a pain to cut and bend to the shape that you want in later steps, but it is absolutely what you should get for your plants if you're looking to make a moss pole that is about 2 feet or taller. Then you will need some coated garden wire, so this will be used to tie the garden mesh together as well as tie the plant up to the pole. So this is very gentle, flexible wire. I decided to make sure that this wire matched the garden mesh, so they are both green, but of course you can choose whatever color you want. And then lastly, you will need some sort of wire cutter. I definitely don't recommend scissors, but this will work just fine. You will probably experience at least a little bit of pain regardless, because cutting the garden mesh is tedious. I will not lie to you. Okay, so those are all of the supplies you will need. And now, how do you create a moss pole? First step is to dampen your moss. That's pretty straightforward. I kind of just had my moss in one container, soaked it in water, let it sit for a little while, and then transferred it to another little saucer after squeezing out that excess water. I fluffed it up and there we go, dampened moss. The next step is a little bit trickier. So you're gonna take your garden mesh, and this is where you're gonna have to figure out how big you want your moss pole. So when I made the 5-foot moss pole for my micans, this is just kind of like a benchmark for you. I have the micans and I think it's about a 10-inch pot, and like I said, the moss pole is 5 feet tall. I went about 15 squares in and cut it that way. I hope that makes sense. For the plant that I am doing today, I think I'm gonna do, let me see. For the moss pole I'm making today, I know I want to make a 3-foot tall moss pole, so obviously that will be one of the dimensions. And then where I cut it in terms of length, I will probably eyeball it. I will put in how many squares I go in up on the screen once I start cutting it. Once you've kind of figured out your dimensions, go ahead and take your wire cutters, and it is a bit tedious, but you just want to go through each little hole and make a little cut. This is definitely hands down the worst part of making this moss pole. When I first made it, I had a bunch of little tiny scratches on my hands. It looked like I just, handled a cat or something. It was ridiculous. But once you get this part done, I promise it's a bit more smooth sailing. The garden mesh was scaring. Hi, it's okay. I love you too. Oh, look, you have little yogurt on your face, huh? Oh, yeah. Anyway, so after all of that, you should have a little something that looks like this. Obviously, it may vary depending on the size that you made. So now that you have your mesh wire, it's time to bend it in shape. And I'm gonna go the cylindrical route, so it's a real pole. But you can also make like a flatter board shape with this method, but you probably will need a little bit of a longer piece of mesh, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna show you the cylindrical. I'm just gonna kind of like slowly work it so that it's bending forward. You don't wanna go too strong, otherwise, you're probably gonna bend the wire, which is not what you want. So definitely go easy, but eventually you will have a nice little concave thing going on. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Don't beat yourself up if it's not perfect, because also remember, we will be tying things up at the end. Okay, so congratulations, you now have a moss pole shell. The next step will be to kind of just shove spag in here. So bring out your damp spag. Basically, the step is very simple. You're just gonna go ahead and shove spag into the little opening that you have. Try to find a good middle ground of where it's compacted so that there are no big air pockets. However, don't make it so packed that there's no room for roots to wiggle in, because that's the main idea of the spag. So just go ahead and do that. Go up and down. It's okay if it kind of overflows a little bit. There will be some time to clean up your pole while we we tie it together. Hello! So another update. Emotionally feeling kind of tired, physically bleeding a little bit on my palm, but we're doing it. Nobody said moss poles are glamorous. So now that you have this stuffed moss pole, basically what you're gonna wanna do is take the wire that we talked about, and I would pre-cut a bunch of like, I don't know, maybe 2-inch pieces. And you're gonna go up and down the pole and tie together the little squares or the grid at about like 1 to 2 inch intervals. All you really do is take your wire and loop together the 2 ends, and then I tie about 2 knots and then cut off the excess wire. So just go ahead and do that all the way up and down the pole. Once you're done doing the 1 to 2 inch intervals, you can see if there are any other gaps that need a little extra reinforcement, and you will be ready for the last step. I don't know why I love doing this, but this is what my room looks like right now. So if you make a moss pole and you make a huge mess, it's completely normal. So we have the subscriber plant here in my amazing Good and Planty pot. One more shout out to Ileana and Lynn for this beautiful gift. But anyway, now let me show you how I pot up plants with a moss pole. So basically, take your pot, and I'm just gonna have a little bit of like a base filling first. Do that. Okay, let me move you down actually so you can see what I'm doing a little better. Oh my god, look how much swag is on my pants. Okay. So sorry that this isn't the cutest angle, but it is what it is. I put in like a little bit of a base, you know, maybe a couple inches, and now I'm gonna make a good hole down. Take the pole. I'm gonna put it in the center, but you can also, you know, put it towards the back if your root ball is really tightly knit. My plant is a bunch of cuttings, so I think I'm gonna be able to divide them and put them around, but just be mindful of that when you're figuring out where to place your moss pole. I'm gonna use a stool to kind of support it a little bit. Look at me. Okay, then I'm gonna take the plant, and I'm just gonna make a huge mess, I guess. Okay, so now I'm just gonna kind of place them around the moss pole. Ta-da! So that's like a rough, you know, example of what I have. Let me show you, hold on. So here's a close-up of what I have going on. I have a base layer of soil down there, the moss pole jammed in there in the center, and then I laid out all of my cuttings kind of how I want them to lay. And now I'm just going to backfill so that I have a good stable pole and all of the roots are covered, obviously. The trick here is you want to make sure that nodes are touching the moss pole. So that is definitely the most important thing to keep in mind, because you want to encourage the roots to grow into this bag. I'm just gonna use the excess wire that I had from tying together the moss pole. I think it came out really nice, and I'm so excited to show you all. Okay, so it has been quite some time since I last checked in with the initial moss pole tutorial. So long, in fact, that I went through not 1, but 2 camera changes. So I do look a little bit different right now. Not only do I have some changes with the camera, but I have some very exciting plant updates. So next, let's talk about what to expect in terms of plant growth. How can you really know that your plant is taking to your moss pole, and what do the benefits of the moss pole actually look like? Well, I'm about to share that with you. So I do have the micans right here. The pothos does have a little bit of growth happening, but it is winter time, so it's not anything crazy. I actually think that the micans will be a better demonstration of the benefits of the moss pole. So this isn't going to be a very elaborate section, but basically you will notice aerial roots really growing into the moss pole. There are definitely a couple sections on the micans that I can see the aerial roots being really healthy, so they're not getting dried out because they actually have moisture and something to grow into. The leaves that have grown since putting it on the moss pole, you might notice like 1 or 2 smaller leaves just because the plant is acclimating, but at this point I can tell that this micans is putting out some larger growth, which is super exciting. In fact, one of the stems pounds is actually already at the 5-foot mark. So once that leaf comes in, I will continue to propagate pretty much. So in general, those will be the biggest changes that you will see. Healthy aerial roots growing into the moss and eventually larger leaves. Now let's talk about moss pole maintenance, which is a thing, especially with these kinds of moss poles. A lot of people wonder, how do you keep them moist? How often should you be watering them? How do you water them? So here I am to answer all of those questions. Basically, I am watering my moss pole about 1 to 2 times a week. You do want to strive to keep the pole at least a little bit moist at all times. The same rule that applies to soil does apply here. You don't want to keep it super wet all the time. To water my moss pole, what I do is I take my watering can and I basically just water at the top of the moss pole in like the little hole that I've created and just let the water pour down. It does get a little bit messy the longer I wait to water the moss pole because it's a lot more rigid and it's like less quick to absorb the water. So as I'm up top there just watering down the moss pole, I wait to see water kind of trickling down to the base of the moss pole, and then I let it kind of absorb for a little bit, and then I just poke my finger in here and there making sure that it is moist. Doesn't really matter so much if the inside of the pole is as moist as the outside because that's actually where the aerial roots are going to go. So just think of it kind of as another plant that you want to water here and there. I do want to say that you don't want to go crazy with getting a lot of moisture at the bottom of the moss pole, and that's just because I want to be mindful that there are roots in the soil and the moss pole does go kind of around the roots inside the pot. Also keep in mind that as new growth starts to emerge out of the soil, make sure that you are slowly starting to pin it up on the moss pole as well. And as your vines get longer, you are also going to want to pin up those pieces if they aren't naturally growing in. Okay, so that's pretty much it for building, maintaining, and I don't know, supervising moss poles. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and show you kind of where the pothos is because it is a subscriber plant. So I did put it in my Mars Hydro grow tent so that it has a little bit of kind of like a boost because I really want that plant to be successful. Again, there's no crazy growth going on, but I really just wanted to give you an update since I heavily featured that plant in November. Okay, so that's gonna be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned everything you need to know about moss poles. If you didn't, please feel free to drop a comment down below. Subscribe if you found this video helpful. It would really help my channel. And yeah, I think that's it. I hope you have fun building your moss pole. I will see you in my next video. Bye!